Okay, animal behavior part dos, which is Spanish for two. Let's continue our discussion of animal behavior by first talking about communication. What is communication? Communication is the conveyance of information to other individuals. So, in classical studies of communication, you have to have an interaction between a signaler and a signal receiver. Right? So right now I'm the signaler, I'm talking, and you're the signal receiver. You're listening, hopefully. And so this is true in all types of communication. So someone has to give a signal, and then someone has to receive the signal, and then they have to know what it means. So what is this guy signaling? Well, he's signaling a pretty universal display of "Don't mess with me. Look at my giant teeth." So that signal is pretty easily interpreted, and this case would be a behavioral or visual signal. But signals in communication come in all sorts of different categories. In other words, there's all different types of communication that animals do. So animals will do acoustical signals. This is simply sounds. So a male will sing and a female will hear it, and she'll either decide that she likes it or that she doesn't. Crickets will chirp at night, and the females will hear the sound and they'll either like it or not like it. So, what's nice about acoustical signals? Well, they're pretty cheap to make. Making a sound doesn't take a ton of energy, right? And you just have to have ears, and ears are pretty good for not getting eaten and other things. So it's pretty easy to be a receiver of acoustical signals. And plus, they can go long distances, so you can make a sound and it can be heard over a long distance. And so acoustical signals are good for communicating over large distances. You can communicate with sound at night, like the crickets do. It can be a cluttered environment. It can be a dark environment. So where visual signals, which we'll talk about next, might break down or not work, then you can do sound. Visual visual signals are just basically any signal that can be seen with the eye. So humans use facial expressions and body language, which is one of the reasons that these YouTube video lectures kind of stink, right? You can't see me waving my arms around. I can't tell if you're asleep or if you're laughing at my dumb jokes or if you're crying or whatever you're doing. So visual signals typically can become ritualized. So in other words, they can become stereotyped over time. So in humans, a ritualized visual signal is a smile. So a smile means I'm happy. It means I mean no harm, and that's true pretty much in all, unless someone's trying to trick you. That's true in pretty much every human culture across time and space. Visual signals can be used in daytime, or they can be used at nighttime if you have a way of lighting up. So a firefly uses a visual signal. It creates a light in the darkness. Um, so yeah, visual signals can be pretty cheap too. Once again, you're going to have eyes, so you might as well be cued into to what's going on visually. Notice too that communication can fall under several categories. So normally when you're having a conversation with someone, you might be listening to their acoustical signals, what they're communicating through sound, but also you're going to be looking at them and you're going to be taking in clues from their body language and their facial expressions and so on. Chemical signals carry messages through chemicals. Shocker. So an example of this would be pheromones. So a queen bee, for example, can produce chemicals um, that go into the air and diffuse throughout the hive. And those chemical signals basically are her way of controlling the workers in the hive, telling them what to do, telling them, when they should go find food, when they should stop, or when they should move the hive. Ants use chemical signals. So an ant scout will go out, maybe find some food, and it'll lay down chemical markers that allows the next ant to follow that trail and find the food source. Chemical signals are nice because they can be very specific. So we can't smell the chemical signals of an ant, but an ant can. And so they're very species specific. Compare that with, visual signals, a firefly. Anybody with eyes can see a firefly lighting up at night. Or an acoustical signal. Anybody with ears can hear a bird song. So chemical signals can be specific, but they can also be, they might not be able to use chemicals if it's really windy or if it's raining, so the environment is going to affect them. Tactile signals. Tactile signals are basically communication through touch. And so tactile signals, one of the pros and cons, I guess, would be that they're only used over a short distance. You have to be in touching distance of whoever you're trying to communicate with. So in a lot of animal societies, like these parrots, parrot 1 is grooming parrot 2, or these are macaws actually, and so it's removing parasites, and that can lead to bonding. So anyway, same with humans. So we can touch each other, hold hands with your boyfriend or girlfriend, whatever, and this is communicating through touch. Electrical signals is another way that some animals can communicate. So for example, some fish can send out these electrical signals, and electric eels are an example. They can communicate to other eels that there's a threat, or that they're ready to breed, or that there's food nearby. So electrical signals are nice, you can produce them, but they work best if you're in water. So electricity doesn't move through air very well, but it does move through water. So we mostly find electrical signals in aquatic organisms. And communication is so important that some relatively simple animals have some pretty complicated ways of communicating. So case in point, the honeybee. So honeybees need to go out and find food. They fly around and visit flowers and pick up pollen and nectar. But they want to be very efficient. So they don't want to just go look for flowers. They want to know where to go. So bees will communicate to other bees where to find food. And they do this not through acoustical signals or tactile signals, but through a visual signal where they dance. So a scout will go out and it finds a good food source. It comes back to the hive, and then the other worker bees might gather around it and watch it, and it will do a waggle dance. And so basically they're able to code their behavior in a way that the other bees can understand. So what they'll do is they'll move, wiggle their abdomen and move down, right, or move up, I'm sorry, and then they'll kind of like go around and then do it again and go the other way and then do it again and go the other way. So it's kind of like a figure 8. And what researchers found was that the direction of the dance signals where the food is, so what direction they should fly when they leave the hive. So if they go down, right, if their head faces downwards, then then the other bees need to leave the hive and fly away from the sun. If they go up, it's the opposite. So if they do the dance upwards, then the worker bees need to leave the hive and fly toward the sun. What did I say? Did I say that right? Going down, they need to fly away from the sun. Going up, they need to fly towards the sun. If they go at an angle, then they need to fly at an angle relative to the sun. Well, they also need to know how far to fly. So the duration of the dance signals how far away it is, right? So the direction of the dance signals the direction of the flight, and the duration of the dance signals the duration of the flight. So this increases honeybee efficiency, and frankly, communicating through dancing is a pretty cool way to communicate. What about reproductive behaviors? So earlier this semester we talked about reproductive strategies, so like parental care, courtship rituals. What else do we talk about? When to reproduce, all that good stuff. So reproductive strategies are just the set of behaviors that lead to reproductive success. So one of these reproductive behaviors is parental investment. Parental investment is the time and energy devoted to the production and rearing of offspring by the mom and the dad. So females typically contribute more investment than males, right? And so we've kind of talked about this already, I believe. So in birds, for example, it's typically the male that has to win the female's affection. So peacocks are the classic example. So the male says, you know what, I'm worth mating with. I know I'm not going to contribute a lot other than some sperm, and I'm going to basically mate and leave, but I'm the best male around. You know why? Because I was able to grow these ridiculous feathers. So the male is able to signal his quality visually. So because this male was able to grow bright blue feathers and this big elaborate train of feathers. These feathers are expensive to grow, and it's a liability too. Carrying these things around means you're in danger of getting eaten by a fox or something. And so the male says, "Look, I'm the best. I'm the best male around," and so it's signaling its genetic quality. So the males aren't choosy. They'll mate with whatever female will allow them to mate, but the females are going to be choosy. Why is that? Because the females are going to be the ones investing in the rearing of offspring. So they lay really expensive eggs. They're going to have to sit on the nest, which incurs risks of predation. They're going to have to teach the babies how to live and survive early on. And so this leads to sexual selection. This is one reason we have differences in anatomy between males and females. Going back, seahorses. So maybe you've heard that male seahorses get pregnant, not the females. Well, that's kind of true. So the males will mate with the female, and the female lays her eggs in a little pouch on the male's belly. And so seahorses, since the male is doing most of the rearing and most of the investment, and he's the one carrying the babies around, in seahorses, the females have to prove to the males that they're worthy of mating with. So the females have to do a little dance or whatever, and prove that they're the most, worthy mating partner around. So in seahorses, the males are choosy, but the females are not. But in birds, for example, the females are choosy and the males are not. So anyway, that's why, and I didn't talk about this, that's why in birds, a lot of times you get differences in color patterns between males and females. This is why the males are showy and the males sing, and the females are camouflaged and don't sing. It's because they're the ones investing in reproduction, so the males have to invest in courtship. So this leads to different courtship displays. So basically one sex is proving to the other sex, or trying to show the other sex that they're the best mate that can be found. Leks have interesting courting behavior. So they're a type of prairie chicken. Prairie sage grouse, same thing. Is a grouse a chicken? Let's say it is. And so it's actually pretty funny. What happens is the males will all gather together in one section of the prairie, and they'll kind of flatten out a territory, and then they'll do a little dance. And so they're all doing a little dance, maybe strutting their stuff, maybe singing a little song. And the females basically walk down the middle of the lek, and then they decide which male is most attractive, and they mate with them. And so again, this is kind of equivalent of the male peacock growing this elaborate train. These sage grouses are using behavior in order to communicate genetic viability. So animals have different mating systems, and they range. There's all sorts of different types, but the main three categories are promiscuous, monogamous, and polygamous mating systems. In promiscuous mating systems, individuals do not form close pair bonds, and both males and females mate with multiple partners. Pros and cons. Well, the con is you're not forming pair bonds, so there's not a lot of there's not equal investment in rearing the offspring. So in other words, they mate and then they don't see each other again. And so if the female, if her eggs are fertilized, then she's going to have to raise the young on their own. So we find promiscuous mating systems in scenarios oftentimes where there's plenty of resources and parental care and cooperation is not needed. Monogamous mating systems are the opposite. The male and female form a long-term association. So in humans, we call this till death do us part, right? But in birds, some birds are monogamous, and they might be monogamous for multiple mating seasons or only one mating season. But the point is, being monogamous ensures the male that it's the offspring that it's helping to raise are its own. So in other words, in monogamous mating systems, oftentimes you need parental investment from both parents. And so monogamy is a way of ensuring that, is a way of the female ensuring the male that all of its investment is worth it because they're actually his genetic offspring. Polygamous mating systems are when either males or females have multiple mating partners. So Sometimes one male will mate with many females. This is called polygyny. And the opposite of that is when one female mates with multiple males, and that's polyandry. And so this is found in different scenarios. So in polygyny, which again is where you get one male mating with many females, we find this like in seals, for example, where the males will fight, and deer as well. The males will fight, and then the strongest males will have access to a harem of females. So in polygynous systems, you don't really have a need for a lot of males. What you're trying to do is ensure that the strongest male fathers as many offspring as possible. So it's kind of a sexual selection system. Um, in polyandry, the female mates with multiple males. So the point here is to have as much genetic diversity as possible in the offspring. So here you're maybe trying to, hedge your bets. So the female mates with multiple males, and her litter or her clutch has offspring from several different fathers. So that, again, that ensures lots of genetic diversity. Yeah. All right, so another behavior is social behavior. So social behavior is the interactions that animals have with other members of their species. So this could be things like living together, lots of members of the species living together, like with caterpillars, or penguins creating these big colonies in Antarctica. So one parent, watches over the egg while the other one goes and feeds and brings back food, and then they swap. So social behavior can help increase the fitness of a species. Social behavior can be like solitary or group living. In other words, sometimes with social behavior it might be one-on-one, and other times it might be living in a group. And there's pros and cons to both. So there's pros and cons to living alone and pros and cons to living in a group. So if you're in a group, the pros would be maybe you can have more eyes watching for predators, or maybe when a predator does come, it's going to lessen your chance of getting eaten. The con is there's a lot of you living in the same place, so it's going to be harder on the food supply. So you can really only have group living where there's plenty of food. So you can have group living, if your caterpillar's on one tree, which is a lot of food, or if your penguins living off the coast of Antarctica where there's lots of fish. If you're living in a desert and there's not a lot of resources, then you probably want to be solitary. Solitary has its own pros and cons. So solitary, again, not as much food. You can have more, it's not as hard on the food supply. You can have a bigger territory. But the negative is you might have a hard time finding a mate, or you might find yourself in a one-on-one fight with another species or a predator. Since you don't have anyone else around, you might not see a predator coming. So anyway, there's pros and cons to both, and natural selection has shaped animals to either live in groups or alone. Some animals are really social, and they have social hierarchies or dominance hierarchies. And here, in a dominance hierarchy, you have a social system in which an individual's behavior is governed by its place in a highly structured social ranking. So a good example of that is wolves. So a wolf pack consists of, a few individuals, usually 5 to 10 individuals. And what happens is they kind of work out a dominance hierarchy. So there's an alpha wolf, which is usually a female, and then a beta wolf, which is like second in charge, and then delta and omega and so on. So you kind of have your most privileged wolf that's in charge, so to speak, and then you have lesser wolves that are less dominant and less privileged. So being the alpha wolf means you get to mate, and oftentimes they'll suppress the reproduction of the other mate, of the other wolves. And why would they do that? So if the wolf pack gets too big, too many of them are having babies, then there's too many mouths to feed. And so a wolf pack can limit its population growth through behavior. This ensures that the most healthy, youngest, the wolf that has the best characteristics is the one that's having access to food and reproduction. So the alpha wolf can usually fight her way to the top, And the wolves at the bottom are usually your older wolves, or maybe wolves that are sickly or have an injury or something like that. So when a kill is made, the alpha wolf gets her fill, and then the beta wolf, and on down the line. So this dominance hierarchy ensures that the most fit individuals are getting access to food and reproducing. And also, like I mentioned, it limits population growth. Altruism. So altruism is a behavior that an animal displays that sacrifices its own fitness or reduces its own fitness to help another one, to help another animal. So um, I included this goofy picture because it's kind of cute. This monkey is grooming the dog and picking parasites off of it. So why is it doing that? So the dog is benefiting. It's getting parasites removed. What is the monkey getting out of this? So in other words, it seems to be just, it's giving up time and energy to help this dog, but what does the monkey get out of this relationship? Another example would be organisms that give an alarm call. So like if you've got a group of meerkats and in the savannah of Africa, and one of them's on lookout duty and it sees a hawk or an eagle, it might give an alarm call, scream, basically, yell, make a bunch of noise. And the noise alerts the other members of the troop that there's a predator around and they can all dive under the ground. But the individual that's giving the alarm call is putting itself at risk because there's a predator around, and what is it doing? It's shouting and screaming and making a bunch of noise, which is going to draw the predator's attention. So why would an animal endanger itself to help others? This is altruistic behavior, and it seems to contradict Darwinian evolution, namely that natural selection favors traits that increase an individual's fitness. So giving an alarm call is going to decrease that individual's fitness. So what's going on here? How can altruism evolve? Well, it's kind of complicated. But first, in order to understand, let's talk about the coefficient of relatedness. So the coefficient of relatedness is basically a measure of the percentage of alleles that the altruist, the one that's performing this beneficial behavior, like an alarm call, and the benefits of the altruists, the ones that are hearing the alarm call, share. That was a long definition. It's basically just how related you are. All right, and so if you look at the table, you are if you have an identical twin, then you share 100% of your alleles. So it would make sense if you would sacrifice yourself for your identical twin, because from an evolutionary perspective, if you die, your genes would go on living in your twin, and so your death it doesn't matter that you die. What matters is that your genes are propagated. If you look at how related you are to a parent or to your child, if you have a child, I don't think any of you have a child, but you share about 50% of the genes. So you've got 50% of your mom's genes and 50% of your dad. So if your mom or dad gave their life for you, they took a bullet for you, then half their genes would be getting passed on, and so on and so forth. So you can see from this chart that the further out on the family tree that you go, the less related you are. So you share one out of 128 of the alleles that your third cousin has. All right? And this is why you probably don't feel especially close to your third cousin. Maybe you don't even know who your third cousin is or what a third cousin is, and that's the point. The further away they are in relatedness, the less you really care about them, and the less that you are willing to sacrifice for them. So the coefficient of relatedness says you are probably most willing to take a bullet for your mom or your dad or your brother or your sister, but you probably wouldn't take a bullet for your second cousin once removed, right? And so that's not just by accident, but evolution has kind of programmed us, or the mechanisms of evolution have programmed us to care about our genes and our offspring, and our troop and our wolf pack or whatever, more than we would a stranger or a distant relative. So Hamilton's rule is this cost-benefit analysis, where we can basically use kind of this fancy math equation to figure out when altruism is going to occur. So look at the equation. It's R times B. It's to be greater than C for altruism to be favored by natural selection. So C is the cost to the altruist. So the cost might be, screaming and making a fool of yourself when you see an eagle flying in the sky. That's the cost. Well, when would you do that? You would do that if the relatedness factor is high. In other words, if you're giving an alarm call for a bunch of family members as opposed to a bunch of strangers, then you're more likely to perform altruism. And based on the benefit. So if it's a bunch of pregnant females, right, then you're more likely to be altruistic and give the alarm call than if it's a bunch of old dudes in your animal troop. So relatedness and benefit will determine whether the altruistic behavior occurs or not. So another thing to take into consideration is inclusive fitness. So we've often looked at natural selection in terms of how natural selection shapes an organism and allows it to survive based on how it can take care of itself, how it can get resources and survive and reproduce. Inclusive fitness describes the sum of an individual's fitness plus the fitness through reproduction by its relatives. All right, that probably didn't make any sense at all. So I found this cheesy graphic on Google Images. So let's say that this is you, right? And you've got some offspring. So by reproducing, you're increasing your fitness. Right? This is the whole point of evolution, is for you to pass on your genes to your offspring. Well, if you're living next to somebody else, you might help rear their offspring. And so this would be inclusive fitness. In other words, this offspring of this blue guy is going to benefit by the behaviors of this guy, the yellow one. So maybe this one is the meerkat that's giving the alarm call, and by it giving the alarm call, it won't just help its offspring survive, but it will help the offspring of its sister or brother or cousin or whatever survive. So the inclusive fitness means that the behavior of this meerkat is going to happen if there's a lot of inclusive fitness going on. In other words, if the alarm call is going to provide direct fitness, it's going to help its offspring survive. And if it's going to provide indirect fitness, it's going to help a closely related individual's offspring survive. Right? So if you're walking down the street and you get, you've got your sister with you, and then someone you just met happens to be walking with you and you get mugged, right? Who would you stand in front of? Would you stand in front of your sister or the stranger you just met? And you'd probably try to protect your sister, right? So in other words, the point is the coefficient of relatedness and the inclusive fitness. So you would benefit even if you get killed by the mugger, then your sister, when she has kids, some of your genes, some of your parents' genes would continue to survive. So that's helping shape your behavior. You're willing to take a bullet for your sister in order to increase the likelihood of her offspring reproducing, but you might not be willing to perform a behavior like taking a bullet for a complete stranger because you don't benefit from, your offspring wouldn't benefit from inclusive or indirect fitness, and that's because you're not closely related to them. I don't know if that made any sense. Okay, so this is all kind of wrapped up in the concept of kin selection. So in kin selection, we have a form of natural selection that selects for altruistic behaviors. So in other words, natural selection selects for an alarm call because that behavior is going to increase or it's going to help the genes that this individual has. Those genes are going to continue to persist through the survival of the individuals that it's helping through the alarm call. Does that make any sense? Raise your hand. Any questions? Just kidding. I can't see you. I don't know what's going on. So anyway, the whole point of this is just trying to explain how altruism would evolve by natural selection. All right, reciprocal altruism is really interesting because reciprocal altruism is when um, two two animals perform a behavior where one will help another one in exchange for future help. Okay, so the classic example of this is bats. These nasty bats fly out of their nasty cave and they go bite things and drink blood, right? And they come back to the cave when the sun is rising and they have a belly full of blood and they sleep all day. Well, sometimes a bat might not get a meal, right? And they have high metabolic costs, and by not getting a meal or getting a large enough meal, they might run the risk of starving to death literally overnight. So a hungry bat will saunter over to a bat with a full belly, and it will communicate and say, "Hey, I'm hungry." And the full bat can say, "Okay, you know what? Well, maybe I'll share with you." So it can regurgitate some blood and basically puke the blood into the mouth of the hungry bat, and they both survive. Why would the full bat do that? Why would it give up a partial meal to help someone else? Well, they found that if a hungry bat gets fed by a full bat one night, another night the roles might be reversed, and the hungry bat might have a full belly, and the full bat might have an empty belly. Well, then the bat that had shared its meal can saunter over to the bat that it had given the meal to previously, and it can say, "Hey, I'm hungry," and it's more likely that it would receive a meal. So in other words, if you help me, you scratch my back today, I'll scratch your back tomorrow. That's reciprocal altruism. We find this is true in monkeys and other primates. So if you groom me today, then I'm more likely to groom you tomorrow. Or you share your meal with me today, I'm more likely to share my meal with you tomorrow. And it turns out that individuals that cheat the system get punished. So in other words, if a bat is hungry and it gets a meal from another one, and then the roles are reversed, and the bat that had shared its meal returns and asks to be shared, or asks for a meal to get a meal in return, but then that first bat that got fed doesn't share the meal, then the other, everybody gossips and is like, "Did you hear that Bobby was hungry and Billy fed Bobby, but then when Billy was hungry, Bobby wouldn't feed Billy? Well, let's ostracize Bobby." Did you follow all that? Um, so so reciprocal altruism breaks down if you don't have a way of, punishing the cheaters. And so really you only have reciprocal altruism in closely related, tight-knit and small groups, right? So this is why you might let your roommate borrow $10, right? Because you expect that he'll pay you back. But if a stranger on the street comes up and asks to borrow $10, you're less likely to give them because it would be too easy for them to cheat. They could just disappear. So reciprocal altruism is something we only see in certain contexts, and usually it's small, tightly knit social groups. All right, and then finally, as we wrap everything up, let's talk about eusocialism. So eusocialism is thousands of related individuals live and work together in a colony for the reproductive benefit of a single individual. So, for example, bees display eusociality. So, in bees, only the queen bee reproduces. She lays thousands and thousands of eggs, which hatch into worker bees. And all those worker bees are willing to give their lives to protect the queen. And the reason they do this is because the worker bees are all related. They're all sisters that were born from the same queen, and the queen has their same DNA, so if they can protect the queen, then even if they die, they're helping the overall, genetic diversity of the species. So what we find in eusociality is oftentimes these individuals that are protecting the reproducing individuals will have a division of labor. And so in truly eusocial insect colonies, for example, you might have a reproductive queen, and then worker bees and nurse bees and scout bees and so on. We see the same thing in termites, which this is a picture of here. So you might get a queen that just lays eggs and a king who basically just provides sperm and just lays around like a lazy slob all the time. And then you get termites that are workers and different types of soldiers. And so this complex social pattern evolves over time, and it's set up in a way that it doesn't reward individual members of the species, but it rewards the species as a whole. So natural selection works on the colony level and not the individual level. What we see in the insects is that there's a whole spectrum of eusociality. So maybe you've seen paper wasps building a little nest in the corner of your porch. They're not eusocial, but they're primitively eusocial. In other words, they might have a division of labor, they might work together to build the nest, but they don't have a queen and workers and soldiers. But at some point along the way, as wasps evolved, some of them evolved into having true advanced eusociality, like we see in a yellow jacket nest or in a beehive. So in other words, eusociality is selected for by natural selection. Some insects maintain solitary behavior, others display some level of eusociality with some kin selection working together, whereas others are truly eusocial and have a division of labor and different castes and individuals that are sacrificing themselves for the good of the group. All right, well, I really like this chapter. I don't know how much of it came across over the video. I've been talking for 35 minutes, 36 minutes. But I hope you watch this, and you can hit me up in the Zoom if you have any questions. So Zoom on Friday if you watch this before Friday. That's it. Later.